Hello everyone, this is Brother. I am bringing you another video about the MTG Arena Cube format. I love this format. I've been playing it non-stop, and I've had some pretty decent success, winning quite a few runs, 7-0, 7-1, 7-2, you name it, but mainly I've been getting my gold back. I want to make another video here about the blue-red archetype, and I'm about to show you a deck list that not necessarily a deck list, but a list of all the cards that you could draft in order to make your deck much stronger. I want to focus on this deck, not only because it is a lot of fun to play, but also because I think it might be the best deck in the format, for reasons that I will dig into later. So, sit back and enjoy the show. And by enjoy the show, I mean, take a look at this list that I have compiled here. These are all the cards that I think you could draft in order to make a successful deck. Do not mind the lands up here, that is just for display purposes. We are going to be focusing on this list of cards here, which I have separated by their mana cost. So, let's start with the basics, right? Blue-red as a deck format, I think, is a very exciting deck archetype because it combines the aggro mentality of red along with the more controlling aspects of blue. This means that you're going to be focusing on low cost cards that can take quick control of the game, but also you're going to be holding back 2 to 3 mana every turn when you can in order to save up those key counter spells, because that is what separates this deck from mono red. It allows you to do quick damage, but also put your opponents in very uncomfortable situations. Now, I said I think this might be the best deck in the format, and I'm not just saying that because it makes a great clickbait statement. I think it might be the best because while mono red might be the strongest deck in terms of simplicity and immediate strength, blue and red is much more flexible in how it can be built. As you can see here on this list, I have detailed all the cards that you can absolutely draft and have a very successful deck. I have made a video with some of these cards, and after this I'm going to show you one of my deck lists where I'm using slightly different cards. And it's pretty successful regardless of which of these cards you draft. You just need to make sure that you get enough of the engine cards and enough of the key finishing bombs. Like this. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. So, first and foremost, we have these 1-drop spells. Now these are not creatures, I will get into the creatures in a moment, but these are the spells that if you see, you should absolutely prioritize them. This is what really sells the deck, these quick cast spells that generate lots of immediate value. The first one I want to point out is the enchantment Curious Obsession. Super strong card. Gives you 1/1, gives your creature 1/1, and also allows you to draw every time it deals damage. Now, as you can see, these creatures here, the creatures that I have highlighted, are all 1-drop creatures with flying. The goal is to use Curious Obsession in order to make those cards as potent as possible. Not just because you will be dealing 2 damage every turn, but mainly because you will be drawing. And drawing allows you to build card advantage, allows you to draw into those counters or even those lands that you might be missing, right? Very strong card, all around good. Its only drawback is that you have to attack every turn. If not, you must sacrifice the enchantment. But in a deck where your goal is to win as quickly as possible, attacking is not a drawback whatsoever. Second card I want to highlight here is Opt. I do not think Opt is necessarily a first pick priority if you see it in the pack, but it is certainly one to consider as the cards in each rotation thin out. Opt is a fantastic card. You scry and you draw, it costs 1. It works very well with other creatures like Sprite Dragon because it is an instant that you can play on your opponent's turn. It works very well from the beginning. It can help you find mana, it can help you find instants, you name it. Fantastic card all around. Third card I want to highlight here is Silent Departure. This is an incredible card, mainly because it has flashback. A 1 cost, return target creature to its opponent's hand. It's very useful when you want to push through and hit your opponent. If your opponent has any tokens, bam, this card gets rid of it for the cost of 1. If your opponent has a very big creature, send it back to your opponent's hand. You might even be able to counter it on your next turn. It is a very strong card, and late game it has value because of its flashback, meaning that when you're really racing and trying to finish your opponent off and they are trying to finish you off or stabilize, you can just bounce creature they have, whatever blocker they have, and hopefully go for game. Very good. This next card I want to point out is Shivan Fire. It's basically a shock just for creatures. The reason I highlight it here is also because the kicker. You get to mid to late game, hit it, triggering the kicker can make it a very powerful way to remove opponent threat. There really isn't much else to say. It's an instant, it's red, it gets rid of your opponent's board. Very, very good, and it's incredibly useful in the early stages of the game. If you are on the play, meaning that your opponent goes first and you are playing second, it's a very good card to have. Maybe turn 1, you play a mountain, your opponent plays a creature that has 2 or less HP and 2 or less toughness, and bang, you hit them with a Shivan Fire, that creature is gone, allowing you to play into an open board. Fantastic. Shock works the same way, except Shock is much more flexible. Though it does not have the kicker of Shivan Fire, Shock can hit any target. Planeswalker, creature, or player. Shock is a fantastic card, it synergizes very well with the deck and this archetype. Before I get any further, I just want to give you a general rule of thumb. In the blue-red archetype, your goal is to win as quickly as possible while implementing some control elements. Basically, if you just wanted one sentence in order to understand how to use this deck, just know that you want cards that are low cost, that can take quick advantage of the board state, and make your opponent's life very difficult from turns 1 to 5. Alright, with that in mind, I bring you to the 1-drop creatures. They're all blue. Notice that I did not push any of the 1-drop red cards. That is because I do not think any of the 1-drop red cards are worth prioritizing. Now, if they fall to you, take them, by all means. But, like Scorching, Scorching, Flame Spitter, for example, great in a mono red deck, great especially if you have Torben in your deck. Otherwise, it does not synergize as well, it does not offer that same mid-game value. But on the other hand, a card like this, which I really should learn how to pronounce, Peturamander, is a fantastic card because it's a 1-drop flying, and as the game progresses, its adapt becomes easier to utilize. Now, I've only used the adapt maybe in like 2 out of my 5 arena runs using this deck, but it's nice to have there. Most of the time, you're just using it as a 1-drop flyer that early game you're using to poke your opponent down, and late game you might use to trade. If you can pump it with Curious Obsession, you have yourself a very powerful early game creature. Siren Storm Tamer works pretty much the same way, except it has a very useful effect in that you can pay 1 blue, sacrifice it in order to counter a spell that targets a creature you control, a spell or ability, making it quite flexible. This is an incredible card. Early game, you poke your opponent down, maybe you use it with Curious Obsession, and as you get into mid game, you can use it to protect, let's say, your Annex, to protect your Rampaging Pharastodon, your Legion Warboss, to protect them from your opponent's instant spells. Very useful. I really enjoy using this card, and I would say that it's probably the second best out of the 1-drops. The best 1-drop here, Spectral Sailor. This card is fantastic. It is a flash card, meaning you can play it during your opponent's turn, meaning it also synergizes with another card I will mention here, Brineborn Cutthroat. It has flying, meaning that it works very well with Curious Obsession, and it also has an ability. You pay 3 and 1 blue, you draw a card. I mean, it's a fantastic card. When you get to that mid to late game point, drawing can be very useful. Even if you don't draw directly into what you need, you're thinning your deck out, you're pulling resources, and hopefully pulling ahead. So, this rounds off all of the 1-drops here. You can see a lot of the 1-drops are blue, and a common theme you will see is that the early cards, the cards you play during the early game, are going to be blue heavy, with your finishers being more in the red color group. Alright, now let's get to the 2-drops. So here I've highlighted all of the 2-drop non-creature cards that you will use, the non-creature spells, and you will find that most of them are counters and card removal. There's a reason for that. This is what the deck is made for. In fact, I would argue that your 2-drops are the most valuable cards in this deck. Yes, your 4-drops and higher will let you win the game. Your 2-drops are what make this deck so unique. This is what I think puts this deck above all of the other control decks or aggro decks. These 2-drops give you so much flexibility, so much range, and really make your opponent's life miserable. Essence Scatter, it's a fantastic card. 2-drop counterspell, counter any creature. Now, sometimes I will use this early. Most of the time, I want to be using this card around turn 3 to 5. In Cube, that tends to be when stronger creatures hit the board. You want to stop your opponent's Legion War Boss, their Tectonic Giants, their Torvan. Let's see, what are some other cards that people use? Like 4-cost flying creatures, 5-cost cards, or even late game, if you can stop an even bigger creature, Essence Scatter becomes all the more valuable. Of course, early game, if you do not have a flyer, you may need to stop. Let's say you may need to counter their card, especially if you are on the play, because that might mean that you can drop a Captain Lannery Storm immediately. Now, earlier, I think I might have misspoke when I described the difference between on the play and on the draw. So hopefully in the comments, someone can correct that. Otherwise, I hope you understood what I meant. Anyway, in the same vein, Negate is just like Essence Scatter, but instead this is for non-creature spells. In a format where some of the strongest individual cards are enchantments and planeswalkers, Negate is a fantastic card. This is a card that you will most likely not use early. If your opponent wants a Scorching Dragonfire, Siren Storm Tamer, or Spectral Sailor, I usually just let them, especially if I know that next turn I'm going to be playing a better card, right? But Negate becomes more useful as the game drags on. When your opponent goes for that key Shatter the Sky, nothing crushes their dreams quite like a Negate. 2 mana, it really serves its purpose well. Quench is another card. Now this one is a catch-all card, and the only downside is that Quench is usually much better served early game. Past turns 5 or 6, which hopefully you have won by then, but past turn 5 or 6, Quench does not work as well, as your opponent might be willing to pay the 2 mana cost, especially if they're running a card like an enchantment or an artifact that gives them more mana. Quench might be less useful. On the other hand, Quench catches everything, and it's a fantastic card to use early. Your opponent wants to play their Rampaging Ferocidon? No, you hit them with Quench. Your opponent wants to negate your counterspell? No, you hit them with Quench. Your opponent wants to drop Embercleave? You get the idea. Quench works very well in order to cover all your opponent's threats. Very nice. The last half here is Essence Capture. While I would not prioritize this the same way I would prioritize these 3 counter spells, those 3 being Essence Scatter, Negate, and Quench, Essence Capture can be useful. It is a good way to sometimes pump up one of these weaker flyers, it is a good late game in order to put one of your bigger creatures over the edge, and it also stops a creature spell. The downside, and the reason I do not value it as highly, is that Essence Capture is not as flexible in the blue-red deck. Its 2 blue cost means that it's a little bit harder to use early. By mid-game, it shouldn't be an issue. Early game, it can be, at times, quite restrictive. So, there's that. Now, the red spells here are just your standard removal. And you might notice that the ones I've highlighted are all instants that can do 3 damage. I find that really is what separates the weaker removal from the stronger removal. Fire Prophecy only hits creatures, but it allows you to basically exchange a card in your hand with the top of your deck. Very nice card. Sometimes it's what you need if you need to get rid of an excess mana, an excess land, or look for that missing land. Fire Prophecy can be the key card for you. Lightning Strike is fantastic. Hits 3 damage to any card. It's very strong. Scorching Dragonfire, another fantastic one. Gets rid of Planewalkers, exiles creature. This card is nice because it avoids Afterlife, or it avoids any death effects. So, if you see these, sometimes they are worth grabbing first in the pack. I would say the same is true for all of these counter spells except for Essence Capture. And perhaps Negate to a certain extent, but I would say really that all of these 2 drops are very key cards. They are the cards you prioritize. They are very strong. They are really what makes this deck work. Now, the 2-drop creatures are important too. Here we have Brineborn Cutthroat, and as you can see by this collection of cards that are very easy to cast, and the cards that can be cast during your opponent's turn, Brineborn Cutthroat is an easy pick to work into the blue-red deck. It's a flash card. It has 2/1, and it becomes stronger the more spells you play. Very common turn 3 move for me is, let's say if on turn 3, I have this card in my hand, I might not do anything. My opponent plays a card, they attack, whatever. Then, during the end phase, I summon Brineborn Cutthroat. Perhaps I use a shock to get rid of a creature. Perhaps I use a Spectral Sailor just to drop another body, and now, during my turn, I can really start putting pressure on my opponent with a 3/2 creature, sometimes an even stronger creature, that can become quite out of hand very quickly. Very good card. Now I have Hypnotic Sprite here, and some people might be surprised because it does not seem like that useful of a card, but what makes this card great is its flexibility. Its Adventure is a counter spell, which is a catch-all counter spell for cards that are worth 3 or less, or that have a mana cost of 3 or less. Makes it very good. Another card that you want to be using early, and it's still even useful in late game. There's a lot of cheap cards in Cube, especially because there are so many aggressive decks running around. Very good way to put them down. And when you're out of creatures, when we're talking about, turn 6, turn 7, this could be what puts you over the top. A 2/1 flyer sometimes is more useful than it seems. Still, I would definitely prioritize Brineborn Cutthroat over Hypnotic Sprite, but it is something there. Another adventure card that is worth considering is Rimrock Knights. Now, Rimrock Knights, it really depends on what you need for your deck. I would say Hypnotic Sprite is more useful if you're low on counter magic. Rimrock Knight is more useful if you're low on aggressive pressure. Its instant allows you to make another creature stronger, gives them an extra power of 2, and when you summon it is a 3/1 card. It can't block, but most of the time that's fine, because you're looking to attack as soon as you can. So, very useful card, dual purpose. Really, the adventure cards make a nice touch here in this 2-drop slot. Now, one of the best cards in this deck, one of the best cards in Cube, arguably one of the best cards, well, not anymore, but at a point one of the best cards in Standard, is Robber of the Rich. This card is incredible. I've talked about this card at great length before. I think many people have talked about it, about how strong it is or problematic, but it is fantastic. It has reach, it has haste, it is 2/2, it only costs 2 mana, and it allows you to replenish your hand at times. It allows you to take cards off the top of your opponent's deck. It is so useful. There have been so many games where I've won because of Robber of the Rich hitting the board turn 2. Sometimes you disrupt your opponent's mana growth. Sometimes you, and by mana growth I just mean you hit the land off the top of their deck while you have fewer cards. Sometimes you can hit a key spell that your opponent wants to use, and then now you can use their own Scorching Dragonfire against them, their own Sprite Dragon, whatever, you get the point. I've even hit a Robber of the Rich off of Robber of the Rich, which, as you can imagine, once the second robber hit the board, my opponent scooped. It's a very useful card. This card is fantastic. Puts pressure, gives you more resources. Definitely an MVP level card in this deck, and arguably one of the strongest cards in Cube. So good. Now, Sprite Dragon is here. I don't like to prioritize Sprite Dragon as much, because you already have some decent flyers early on. Its 2 mana cost means that you have to wait till turn 3 before it can become a 2/2 creature, at the earliest. But it still is useful, especially if you're low on creatures. Sprite Dragon almost always wheels, meaning this is not a card that you have to prioritize, let's say like Robber of the Rich, or even some of the earlier mentioned cards. Sprite Dragon will almost always wheel back to you, in which case, you take it. And if you see that you have the space for it, you use it. If you don't have the space, that's fine. It's an easy card to push to the side. Now, we have really finished what I would say are the low-cost cards here. This is what I would say is like with the exception of 2 cards that I'll get to later, this is what gets your deck going. This is what makes your deck unique versus mono red or more blue control-oriented decks. This is really the meat and potatoes of the deck. So now we're going to be moving on to your mid-game plan. Your mid-game plan is very simple, and it consists really, let me move this over here. And it consists of these cards. They are all red, and that is because the red cards are just very powerful. Here, we have Bone Crusher Giant. Fantastic card. Your opponent cannot prevent damage this turn once the instant goes off, right? So its adventure is very useful. It's basically a 2-cost shock that prevents damage. It's very good. You can hit your opponent's Planeswalker, you can hit their life total, you can hit a creature. Super good. And afterwards, it becomes a monster with a powerful effect that whenever Bone Crusher Giant becomes the target of a spell, it deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. At a 4/3 monster, or 3/3 drop, Bone Crusher Giants, it gives you that kind of repeated value that you really want to be using, especially in a deck like this. Captain Lannery Storm is a fantastic card. Captain Lannery Storm is a fantastic card. It might seem underwhelming at first. I mean, it has a total cost of 3, being 2 colorless, 1 red, and it only has 2/2 body. But it has haste, and its effect is really what sells it. Whenever it attacks, you create a treasure token. That treasure token can be used to generate any mana that you might be missing. And now, in this deck, I tend to run a low mana cost, something I will get into later. But your average cost is usually going to be something around like 2.2 to 2.7, depending on how heavy you build it or how light you build it, in which case, Captain Lannery can be very useful. You can cut off some mana and know that you do not need to worry about fixing your deck because Captain Lannery will be there. Not only that, but sometimes you can get some ridiculous plays where your opponent does not block it and you can sacrifice 2 to 3 treasure and now you're hitting them for 5 or 4 to 5 damage. Very useful card. It's a very good way to put early game pressure on your opponent, and sometimes your opponent will just want to get rid of it because they are tired of the token generation. Which is all the better, because you'd rather they get rid of Captain Lannery than stop some of your stronger cards, which I'll get to in a moment. An example of a stronger card is Legion Warboss. This card is fantastic. It's just like in Mono Red, this card is extremely useful. It generates 1/1 goblins, which you can use to attack your opponent immediately. It is a goblin, which means it synergizes very well with Siege Gang Commander. And Legion Warboss also has Mentor. But if you can get it to stick, it can become quite problematic for your opponents. As you start making more tokens and pumping them up, soon you can really take over a game. It's the kind of early game pressure that you want turn 3. It's the kind of mid-game power escalation that you do want to get in turn 4 and turn 5. Very good card, very solid. This is a card you prioritize. Same thing with Captain Lannery Storm and Bonecrusher Giant. These are all cards that if you see them in your pack, you pick them up immediately, unless you see one of these cards that I'll get to later. But they are very good. Rampaging Ferocidon is an even better card. I think arguably this is another card that might be in the contender for best card in the deck. This card and Robber the Rich, if we're talking about in terms of just individual power. Rampaging Ferocidon has Menace. It prevents life gain, which is very good for an aggro deck, and it also has an effect that every time a player plays a creature, Rampaging Ferocidon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. Super useful. Now, yes, you will take damage, but that's okay, because you most likely has been damaging your opponents more, either with spells to the face, or with your low-cost flyers. Rampaging Ferocidon has Menace, meaning that turns 4 and 5, it might not even be blocked by your opponent, and if they do block it, you have the opportunity to use cards like Rimrock Knights, Scorched Lightning Strike, Fire Prophecy, in order to get rid of 2 or more creatures all in one go. Rampaging Ferocidon is fantastic. I insta-lock this card every time I see it. I think it is so useful, and it really is the kind of card that just keeps on giving. It really makes your opponents scared to play creatures, and it makes you feel all the more comfortable holding your counterspells back, knowing that your opponent has to deal with this card or they will lose. Another great card is Annex. Now, Annex is not the card that I prioritize in this deck. It is very good. However, it is definitely more of a mono red card. If your deck is heavy on red cards, Annex is fantastic. If your deck is not, it is still a suitable pickup, as it can become a quite powerful card, especially once you start getting some tokens on the board. It allows you to survive board wipes more efficiently, because whenever it or another creature dies, you generate 1/1 Satyr creature tokens. Satyr? Sorry, pronunciation is not my strong suit. But it is a pretty good card, can be used as a finisher at times. I find that most of the time, Annex serves as a nuisance that your opponent has to deal with before you play some better cards. Right. Now, I've included Tectonic Giants here in the mid-game cards, perhaps because it is the only 4-drop, well, one of 2 4-drops that I include. So it might be better actually to move this over to the side. But anyway, so this makes up our 3 drops. They're all creatures, they're all fantastic. And as a side note, you might want to put in some cards, let's say, like Tybalt, Ionize, or Rix Factor. I'll get into why they are more of, or even like Chandra, Act of Treason, I'll get back into these cards later. Just know that like I have considered them and they are very strong, but I find that they are much less impactful than these creatures, and this is really what you should prioritize. In fact, if you can get, let's say, 3 of these cards, you're in very good shape, I would say, and you're most likely looking towards a 5, 6, 7 run win, a 7-win run. Now, these 2 cards, these are your 4 drops. Now we are approaching the bomb status. We're approaching the cards that allow you to finish games. I see both of these cards do that quite well. Sphinx of Foresight seems like a card that might be better suited in a control deck, but red and blue gets close. It uses some of the elements of control while keeping in the aggro pressure. At 2 blue and 2 colorless, it is a quite easy card to play. Thankfully, it doesn't have 3 blue, like, let's say like Torban, for example. That makes this a little bit more difficult. Torban's a little bit more difficult to play. Sphinx of Foresight is much easier. It is flying, so it goes over your opponent's defenders, and it has a very useful ability. If you reveal this card in your opening hand, you are able to scry 3. It's a fantastic card. It allows you to stack your deck to make sure that you get the ideal curve that you're looking for. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Sphinx of Foresight is on your board, you can scry 1, which is a fantastic ability as well. This is why I like blue-red more than mono-red. It allows you to control your deck in a format where you don't have the same consistency that you have in Standard. Even though you have 40 cards, sometimes you just get the cards that you just end up with cards that you're not looking for. Sphinx of Foresight helps you prevent that and helps you look for that game-finishing blow as soon as it hits the board. Well, really on the upkeep after it hits the board, but you get exactly what I'm saying. Super useful. Tectonic Giants is another bomb. This card's incredible. You insta-lock this card as soon as you see it. This is a game winner. What's nice about this card is that if you, let's say it's the first card in the pack, you can absolutely draft it and go mono-red. Now, if mono-red does not work out, or if you want to go for something, I think, a bit more flexible, then you can go into blue and red, and Tectonic Giant works well in both. Its dual abilities are fantastic. First ability, deal 3 damage to each opponent. Well, in this case, you're really just fighting one person, so it deals 3 damage to your opponent. Fantastic. It is basically a lightning strike straight to your opponent. And when you combine it with its own power, if it goes unblocked or unchallenged, you're dealing 6 damage from one attack. That's very good. Nice way to put pressure. What makes it so good is its flexibility. Its second ability allows you to exile the top 2 cards of your library. Now, this is very good, as I've talked about this in the past, that it allows you to, or I think I have, it allows you to look at the top of your deck, and you can really choose between 2 cards. Now, sometimes you have to be careful. If you see, let's say, a card like Siege Gang Commander, and you can't play it, that is quite unfortunate, as you lost one of your finishers. However, if you see a card like Spectral Sailor, Shock, Fire Prophecy, any of these type of cards, Tectonic Giant becomes fantastic, because it allows you to get those cards and then play them as soon as you're done, as soon as this effect resolves. It's also very good because you can look for lands, and those lands, sometimes, when you're talking about this mid-game, if you already have Tectonic Giant on the board, and you're looking to play one of your more expensive spells, Tectonic Giant can help you find that land. And it's totally okay. I find that in the early stages of the game, that second effect is much more useful than the first effect. However, when you get close to the end, you usually want to go for that 3 extra damage, that first ability, because it really puts your opponent on the clock. A very short clock. A clock that is running out of time. And that is exactly your goal with this deck. So, I only put 4 cards, 2 cards here in the 4 mana cost slot, because I think these are really the only ones worth prioritizing. Sure, there are other cards you can look at, but I think these are the 2 most important. And in general, this is a low mana cost deck, so you're not really going to be drafting expensive cards. You will only draft them if they really help you win the game. Now, when we're talking about winning the game, few cards achieve that in the same way as Torban Thane of Redfell. Torban Thane of Redfell is a card that you're probably very familiar with if you play Standard, or even Commander. Yeah, I'm sure it's in many formats. Right? If a red source you control will deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2. Basically, it gives every card you have shock, every red card at least. This is how you win games. Now, Torban is a bit more restrictive, as it has mana cost that has 3 reds in it, which is most unfortunate. But Torment also has such a payoff that is definitely worth it. For example, if you have Tectonic Giants and Torment on the field, Tectonic Giants' first ability does 5 damage, talking about a fourth of your opponent's HP. If there have been some games where I have Torment out and then I can just win off of, let's say, a Banefire combined with a Shock, and just put my opponents in a position where from being in a position where they thought they were safe to defeat. Torment is fantastic. It is absolutely a card you prioritize. It's a card you get in your first, your second, your third pick. It's very strong. The next card here that you also prioritize in your back, Siege Gang Commander. This card is incredible. It creates 3 tokens, and it also allows you to sacrifice a goblin in order to deal 2 damage to your opponent. Sure, it costs 2, which means that you're most likely using Siege Gang Commander's effect after a turn after it has already resolved, but it is still a fantastic card. Sometimes you can just swing with Siege Gang Commander and all your tokens, and after your opponents try to block the weak creatures, you can sacrifice them to either clear their board or clear their life. It's good. Real good. Really, really, really good. I mean, I know it sounds like I am exaggerating this card's ability, but I have won so many games that I should have not won, or arguably should have not won, because of Siege Gang Commander just stealing my opponent's opportunity away. Think about it. By the time you can play Siege Gang Commander, you already have 5 lands on the board, at least 5, right? So that means on the next turn, if you play another land, you're able to deal 6 damage to your opponent. It's incredible. If any of the attacks go through, that is only that 6 damage total only goes up. Downside is that it does lose to enchantments your opponents have, which lower the attack and power of your creatures. So that's just something you have to keep in mind. Now here are the other bombs I have. These are also your game winners. Here I have Chandra, Awakened Inferno, and Embercleave. These cards are incredible. Like I've said before, on the higher end, your red cards are going to be what wins the game for you. Chandra, Awakened Inferno does that very well. It can't be countered. It's good. And all 3 of its Planeswalker's abilities are just fantastic at helping you win the game. Its first ability basically gives you a consistent way to poke your opponent out. There have been so many times where I have played this card and been in a position where I know I cannot attack my opponent directly, but I know that I can protect Chandra. So I will keep stacking her ability and even letting some attacks hit her, just so long as I can get 1 or 2 of those procs off. Usually by the time that you play Chandra, your opponent is around 4 to 10 life, right? It has a life total of around 4 to 10. So once these abilities stack, within 3 turns, your opponent is probably done. So, very good. Now, second ability is the one I find I use the least, because this deck does leave some creatures on the board, creatures that usually cannot weather a 3 damage board wipe, but it can be very useful to save you in a pinch if you're going against a mono red deck or another blue and red deck. It's also very good against token decks, because you can just wipe out the whole board. So, second ability is useful. The third ability is really what puts this card over the edge. It allows you to essentially just exile a creature, exile a target creature, or a planeswalker. So, sometimes just one, maybe your opponent was able to get their own Sphinx of Foresight off. Now, you exile it. That's it. Then hopefully you can attack and win. Embercleave is also a finisher. Now, you can just read Embercleave and you can understand why it works so well in this deck. In mono red, it usually costs less. In fact, in mono red, I find that when I play this card, it rarely costs more than 3 mana. In blue and red, it will cost more, it's true, but it still gives you such a high payoff that you have to use it. You know, if you're attacking, let's say with Captain Lannery Storm, you're attacking with Annex or Rampaging Ferocidon, especially let's say a card like Rampaging Ferocidon, it allows you to just chew through your opponent's creatures. They really cannot block Rampaging Ferocidon if it has Embercleave. They really cannot allow Sphinx of Foresight and Embercleave to hit, because then now you're hitting for 10 damage. Right? You can start to see why this card is so powerful, even in a deck that does not run as many creatures as mono red, or is not exclusively a red deck. It is so strong. So really, any of these cards here are first pick worthy. These 2 are your bombs. You may have noticed that these are the only cards I have that are worth 6 mana, And the reason for that is that you really do not want too many high cost cards in your deck. These are the only two 6 mana cost cards for a reason. They are absurdly powerful, but they are only powerful because the rest of your deck has put your opponents in a position where they cannot let them resolve, or, essentially if they resolve, they will most likely lose. If in a vacuum, these cards are strong, but they are not as strong if you play them outside of an aggressive deck. So, and arguably I would say that Chandra is actually better in a blue-red deck than it is in a mono-red deck. Because in the blue-red deck, you have more abilities to protect your planeswalkers. Your quenches and negates can stop an ECD from targeting Chandra, or a planar cleanse, for example. And your low-cost creatures will help protect Chandra from a token, from a wide attack. So, these cards are very, very good. So I'm just going to move some of these cards over. And I'm going to talk about these cards that I have separated just because they have a more varied mana cost. So I figured they deserve their own category. But in reality, they serve a very similar function to other spells, right? So here I have 3 damage dealers, right? Banefire is a sorcery that deals X to any target. What I like about this card is that it is useful early and late game, and it deals damage to any target. Early game, you're most likely hitting minions with this. Let's say it's turn 3, turn 4, your opponent plays a creature, bang, Banefire, get rid of it, and it allows your little 1-drops to continue going to town on your opponents. Late game, let's say if you're hitting your opponent for like 5 or 6 or 7, they cannot counter it. They must just accept that they're eating, let's say, 5 damage straight to the dome. Very powerful card, has many uses, can be used to get rid of powerful planeswalkers, can be used to get rid of your opponent's life total. It's very good. Devil's Play is another good example of that. Arguably, it is better than Banefire, since there are very few decks that are running around with counters, and those that do have counters are usually going to be in a bad position against a more aggressive tempo-based deck, like Blue-Red. Devil's Play does have a flashback, though, meaning that when you start getting to that mid to late game, you might use it one turn and then use its flashback the very next turn, in which case you can really put your opponent out of reach. It's a very nice card, very strong. These are both cards that they are, obviously you do not prioritize them the way that you prioritize these cards. You do not prioritize them the way that you prioritize Essence Scatter, Negate, Quench, Fire Prophecy, Lightning Strike, Scorching Dragonfire. You don't even prioritize it the way that you prioritize, let's say, these 1-drops, if you don't have any of them. One of these 1-drops, and Curious Obsession. But these are very powerful cards when you're finishing out your deck. And they often wheel. I think players outside of mono-red players, there are a few players who really look at these cards and say, that's a strong card. They are strong. They're very good. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Now, this card is fantastic. You will forgive me, I'm not going to pronounce the name, as I have already butchered quite a few names so far. I'll try it. Furforos' Intervention is another one of those dual ability cards. Its first ability is one that I often forget to use, but it is fantastic. You create an X1 Red Elemental with Trample and Haste. This is exactly what you need to finish an opponent, right? If we're talking about turn 4, let's say turn 4, and you've just had one of those dream openings where all of your haste creatures have gone through, you've countered your opponent's spell, sometimes this can be what you need in order to win a game or put your opponent into lethal range. Its second ability is probably the one you will use more, though. This spell deals twice X damage to a target creature or planeswalker. I love this because it's the kind of flexible removal that you can just use at any point of the game. Your opponent dropped a big bomb, spend like 3 or 4 mana, boom, they're gone. Your opponent drops a planeswalker, spend 3 to 4 mana, they're gone. Fantastic, right? It's a very good card, it's very flexible, and this is actually a card that I do prioritize much more than the 2 previously mentioned 1X cards. This is a very strong, or red X I should say, right? Very good card, very strong. And it's often what gives you, the reason I like the blue-red deck more than the mono-red is because of flexibility, and this card is flexibility in a nutshell. Very good. Speaking of flexibility, let's get to the last 3 cards I have here. And well, not that one, actually, because I want to say on the topic of flexibility, Thassa's Intervention is a very flexible card. Its first ability allows you to look at the top X cards of your library. I find that I only use this card when I really am digging for, let's say, like an Evercleave, or if I'm really digging for a shock or something to put my opponent out. Most of the time, you're going to be using its second effect, which allows you to counter a target spell unless its controller plays twice X. That can be a fantastic counter early in the game. It's nice to have a card that allows you to do more than one thing. Now, you will rarely have more than 5 or 6 mana when you are running the blue-red deck. Well, you will rarely have 5 or 6 mana when you're in a position to more than 5 or 6 mana when you're in a position to win. So usually you're only going to pay about 1 or 2 mana. Your opponent can't afford it. It's cube. You know, you're using it on there. You're using it turns like 3 to 7. So very strong card. It has a counter spell. It allows you to search your deck when you're in a pinch. So it's a very powerful card. Entrancing Melody is a card that I think is slept on. This card allows you to gain control of a target creature with a converted mana cost of X. Now, this is useful in a control deck, but I'd argue it's even better in an aggro deck. In mono red, you would probably prefer a card like Act of Treason, because it allows you to swing and probably win immediately. In this deck, however, you're going to be looking for Entrancing Melody, I think, a bit more often, is because it allows you to take control of a creature and keep it. Now, even if you just look at what I've listed here, you're going to find that most of the cards in this deck archetype are non-creature spells, right? So that means, especially when you're drafting, you're probably going to be prioritizing the non-creature spells, especially, after you have already grabbed your bombs like Tectonic Giants and Sphinx of Foresight. So, as you're going on, this allows you to steal your opponent's creature. Sometimes that's good enough to swing past them for game. Other times, this is what you need in that mid to late game. If you ever get to that point, you can take away your opponent's key card. I have taken my opponent's Tectonic Giants. I have taken my opponent's Sphinx of Foresight before. I have taken, even sometimes if they have like a juiced up Sprite Dragon, or if they have like a Stone Coil Serpent, for example. Stone Coil Serpent is actually, or like any token, Entrancing Melody is perfect because it becomes a 2-drop steal, a permanent snatch and steal. You keep that creature for the rest of the game. It's super good. The last card I want to highlight here is Jaya's Immolating Inferno. Now, I must mention that there is a significant restriction with this card. It is a legendary sorcery, which means that it can only be played if you already control a legendary creature or planeswalker. That makes this card a bit more restrictive. While it is good once you're already in a winning position, it's not so good when you're behind. Let's say if you have an empty board, this card is useless. But the reason I say you prioritize this, and this is a priority card, it's absolutely a card that you first pick when you see it, is that its payoff is tremendous. By the time you can use this card, it's usually around turn 6, turn 7, and what you're looking for is a way to put your board over the top. You are trying to win right then and there. This card allows you to wipe your opponent's board, allows you to wipe your opponent's life total. Yeah, it deals X damage up to 3 targets, meaning that you can really just dismantle and immolate your opponent's board. It's fantastic. It's a real finisher. When we're talking about these cards here, you might notice that all 6 of these cards here that are like pay X, all are cards that are designed to put you over the top. And that is what I find that that's what I find that makes actually the cube format so fun, but also so potent if you're, not so potent, but in a way kind of vulnerable if you're playing against an aggro deck. If you look at this build here, all of these cards exploits your opponent's lack of consistency. In Standard, these cards might not be as good, but in a format when you're just kind of like jumbling cards together, Banefire is that kind of catch-all destruction that's very hard to avoid. Immolating Inferno is very hard if you don't have counter spells prepared for it. Entrancing Melody. In Standard, this card might not be so good. Decks are much more streamlined, they can afford losing a creature. In Cube, this card becomes devastating. You might have taken away the card that your opponent was playing, that was setting up for 3 or 4 turns, and now it is yours to do with as you please. right? So these are the best cards here, I would say. These are the cards that you can comfortably draft in order to make a blue-red archetype. As you can see here, there are 37 cards. As you know, a cube deck only consists of 40 cards. And when in this format specifically, you're going to be running 16 to 17 lands, maybe 15 if you're very daring, and you really trust the hand smoothing algorithm. Aside from that, 16 to 17 lands is what you want to go for. And when you run that many lands, or just in general when you have 40 cards, it's comforting to know that 37 out of all the cards in the cube are strong cards, are optimal cards that really will make your deck work, really put you over the top, and hopefully bring you close to that 7-win prize. I know that I have won quite a few times with this deck, and these cards have never disappointed. Well, maybe Sprite Dragon. Sprite Dragon sometimes disappoints. But aside from that, all of these cards will go above and beyond what you need in order to win. Now the sideboard I have here, it's not really a sideboard in the traditional sense. These are just some of the cards I want to highlight here because I think that they could be good. It really depends on your situation. These cards are more like less than optimal versions of the cards I have already listed before. So if you can pull these cards, if you see these cards, they're just hanging around, pick them up. Otherwise, note that it will most likely wheel back to you because other players are not really prioritizing them, and for a good reason, right? So let's go over them quickly. So we have some 1-drops here. 1-drop spells. We have Dive Down. Gives you a target creature you control, 0 and 3, and the creature gains hexproof. That's pretty good. If you're protecting one of your flyers early game, if you want to protect or one of your bigger creatures late game, it's pretty nice. The downside though is I feel like those early creatures are not always cards you want to protect. Sometimes it's okay to let them die. But yeah. Anyway. You have Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce is a solid card, but it's not really, I would say, priority worthy. It's the kind of card that if you pick it up, you can put it into your deck, perhaps, but it is limited. Now, it's nice it only costs 1 mana, but it only works on non-creature spells. Right? And your opponent, like Quench, your opponent pays 2, then this card fizzles. It can be useful to tap your opponent out, but I find that early game, most of the time, my opponents are playing creatures. If this was standard, maybe it'd be nice to stop a Growth Spiral. In Cube, it's just okay. Dragon Master Outcast. Now this card is strong, but like I've mentioned before, you are rarely getting to 6 lands. And when you are in 6 lands, instead of waiting for, let's say, Dragon Master Outcast to generate dragons, you usually want to win that turn. Because by the time you start generating dragon tokens, your opponent might be stabilized. They might have a board clear, and at 1/1, Dragon Master Outcast is surprisingly frail. So, Goblin Banneret, this is basically just a representation for all of the 1-drop red cards. They're useful in a pinch, but they are not really cards you prioritize. In mono red, they're fantastic. In this deck, you want to be going for the flyers that synergize very well with Curious Obsession. Our cards, let's say, like Siren Storm Tamer and Spectral Sailor, that give you some extra boost as you push into the late game. Mutiny is a great card. If you're low on removal, Mutiny can sometimes be used to make your opponent's creatures kill each other. So, it's a good card. It's a 1-drop, worthy of consideration. Downside is against control decks, this card is kind of useless. Against token decks, this card doesn't do too much. And against other aggressive decks, you might find that it's sitting in your hand when you could be using a more proactive card. So, Disdainful Stroke, it's a nice counterspell. If you're low on counterspell, take this. If you already have 2 or 3 counterspells, you don't need it. It's not that good. It can counter a target spell with a converted mana cost of 4 or greater, which means that you're playing your cards like what is that called? Riari's. Oh, I completely forgot. But if your opponent's playing a big enchantment, Disdainful Stroke can be good. Stop big creatures, but I find that most of the time it's sitting in your hand when you do want more proactive cards in this deck. So, same thing with Lava Coil. It's great, it exiles, but you might remember that the other cards I highlighted, like Fire Prophecy, Lightning Strike, and Scorching Dragonfire, are instants, meaning that you can use them during your opponent's turn. That is exponentially more valuable than sitting on a sorcery when you probably want to be playing your own creatures. So, go figure. Some people might disagree, and that's totally okay. I just don't really like Lava Coil. Act of Treason could be good, and I have won games with Act of Treason. I have run it in blue-red, but I find that it is much better in the mono-red archetype. For the purposes of this deck, I would prefer a card like Entrancing Melody, but if you can't get it, you really need, a card to help you win a game. Act of Treason can be really useful. Sometimes you take your opponent's big flyer, and boom, you win game off of it. So, yeah, it's not bad. Chandra, Acolyte of Flame, is an okay card, too. It is pretty useful, but, I think I have made a mono-red Planeswalker deck, which I will make a video for soon, but I think the problem with this card is that you will rarely have defenders for it. You're going to be attacking often, and in mono-red, you might be able to defend it with some of your 1-drops. In blue-red, you're probably not going to defend it, and this card will die soon. Disappointing. Risk Factor could be good. In fact, it is normally good, but in mono-red, it's more useful because you really need those cards to help you draw. You have so many options in this type of deck, and I haven't even listed all the draw power cards. You could even think of like, what is that card like? You could think of, man, what's the name of that card where you discard? Thirst for Knowledge? Is that it? Quenching Thirst? I forgot. But there are plenty of cards that allow you to draw 2 or 3 cards in this deck. There's plenty of blue cards that give you draw power, in which case Risk Factor gives you a much less consistent way to draw cards. When I play Risk Factor, I find that a lot of times my opponent will just eat the 4 damage, and when I can put them in lethal, that's great. When I can't, I have now run out of cards, and I have nothing else to do, and I probably lose. Mono-red, I think it's much better. In blue-red, you have so many more options, so why run this card? Tybalt is another card that could be great, but I prefer it in the red Planeswalker deck. Same problem with Chandra, you can't really defend this card. Also, if you have Rampaging Ferocidon, you have a much better 3-drop that arguably does the same thing, if not better. And the 1/1 Devil Creature that has a death effect, it's useful, but what you want to be doing in this deck is you want to be putting on pressure while also controlling the game. Tybalt costs quite a bit of mana, you're not controlling the board state when he's around, and after you've generated 2 tokens, it just kind of sits there. So, I don't really use it. Ionize. You might have noticed I did not list any 3-drop counter spells, right? Perhaps you can argue that Hypnotic Sprite is a 3-mana counter spell. That's fair. I did not list Neutralize, and the reason is I think Ionize is much better. Neutralize is much more restrictive in how its mana cost works. Ionize is not. And Ionize gives you the bonus, for this deck, right? If you're already playing blue-red, you have a much higher chance of being able to play Ionize than you do Neutralize. And Ionize deals 2 damage to your opponent. It's a counterspell and a shock. It's more useful. I don't list it though because I think the two mana counterspells are so much better. With this deck, with a very low curve, you can see here it has I have a curve 2.3, right? Arguably it will be a little bit higher if I had made the actual deck. It would be like 2.5 or whatever. But Ionize is often, I think, 1 mana too expensive for this deck. So, much better served with Essence Scatter, with Negate, Quench. But if Ionize does happen to wheel to you, put it in your deck. It's very good. It's just not a card you prioritize. Voracious Great Shark seems fantastic, and it can be. But it can also be underwhelming. At a total cost of 5, this card is quite prohibitive in a deck where you're trying to race your opponent down. Remember the bombs of this deck, right? The cards that really win. Embercleave, Chandra, Siege Gang, Torben, Tectonic Giants, Sphinx of Foresight. These are all proactive cards. And while perhaps Voracious Great Shark could be proactive, it absolutely could be played during your opponent's turn, because it has flash, it's also going to be sitting in your hand quite some time. Nothing feels worse than flashing it onto the board and then having your opponent play a really big creature next turn in order to win. So, usually you're going to be saving this card. There aren't that many great artifacts that are worth countering, so Voracious Great Shark is a good card, but it's only worth getting if you do not have any of the bombs I've mentioned previously. In that same vein, charging Monstrosaur is only good when your opponent does not, well, I mean not your opponent, but when you do not have any bombs in your deck. If you are missing, let's say you've already been drafting blue-red, you've gotten all the perfect 1-drops, you've gotten, even more importantly, the best 2-drops you can get, your board, your deck is riddled with destruction magic and low-cost counter spells, and you even get some of the great 3-drops. We've got Captain Lannery, Storm, Rampaging Warboss, Sphinx of Foresight. Your deck is looking great. But you remember, this is Cube, and your deck is going to be much less consistent than it is in Standard. So, you need a card to finish off the top. You miss Evercleave. Let's say Chandra is not available, so you settle for charging Monstrosaur. And it's not that bad. In fact, I would say that both of these cards are pretty solid in their own way. Trample Haste might be better. The Flash might be better. Flash Counterspell might be better. It really depends on what colors you have more of. It really depends on whether your deck is heavier on the counter reactionary side or on the aggressive side. And which one you're looking for really depends a lot on playstyle and the particular combination of cards that you have drafted. So, these cards are decent, but they're more like replacement bombs than they are actual threats in themselves. The last card I want to highlight here is a card that I used to think was a staple in this deck, but I've since then changed my opinion. Ox of Agonas is individually a pretty strong card. In a vacuum, this card is pretty good. It has an effect, an enter the battlefield effect, that whenever it drops, you discard your hand and then you draw 3 cards. Awesome, right? It has an escape cost that is very cheap and very easy to make, very easy to pay. Downside is that you have to exile 8 other cards in your graveyard. So, Ox of Agonas is usually going to be a card that you play once, and then maybe again you play it late game, right? It is a solid card at 4/2, but, maybe if it had Trample, maybe if it had Haste, if it had any of those effects, it would be much stronger. In Mono Red, this kind of card is fantastic. It allows you to replenish your army. In Blue Red, where you have cards, let's say, like Negate and Essence Scatter, or like Ionize, cards that you're waiting to play, then you might be more hesitant to drop the Ox of Agonas. And I had a particular game, in fact, where I had Thassa's Intervention in my hand, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to drop Ox of Agonas, I'm going to draw more anyway, I need a land, blah 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 blah. So I do that, and then my opponent was able to win the game, because they dropped a massive creature that I did not have an answer to, and Ox of Agonas as a 4/2/5 drop looked kind of shabby in comparison. So, yeah, well, oh, okay, and another card that I did not include here, Sark. Let's see if I can find this guy. So let's include cards that do not own. I might be misspelling his name here, so. Another card that I want to include here is Sarkhan the Masterless. Now, in fact, Sarkhan could even be included. I could have included in the main deck. I'm not sure if it would be better in the sideboard. So it's another one of those cards that really depends on what you're looking for. If you do not have any bombs, Sarkhan could be fantastic. However, I still think this is a card that is better in mono red Planeswalker decks. Because, really, the only Planeswalker you are going to be running in blue-red is the big Chandra. Chandra, Awakening Inferno. So, Sarkhan is nice, and when you do get him and Chandra on the board, your opponent is basically in scoop phase, because they can't deal with both 4/4 Flying Dragons and Chandra's stacking abilities. Its ability to summon a 4/4 Red Dragon is pretty nice, and his stack ability that deals 1 damage to everyone who attacks is pretty good, but it's one of those cards that I think is worth it if you do not have, let's say, Siege Gang, Chandra, or Embercleave. Or like Torben. If you already have these cards, then Sarkhan might not be the card for you. You might want to prioritize a lower drop card like Quench, Fire Prophecy, Opt, etc. Alright. So okay, that pretty much wraps up my deck here. Valid deck. So what I just want to show you quickly is my current Arena Cube run. I know this video is already quite long, so I'm just going to keep it short and show you this this build that I have here. As you can see, I am currently 6-1. I am about to get my 7th win, hopefully, right? But this is a very powerful deck, and I'm going to show you here that this version is actually missing a lot of the key cards that I have mentioned before. But I think it still has enough to make it worth running, and this is also why I think it's so good. If you run mono red and you're missing some of your bombs, that deck is not going anywhere. If you run blue and red with some, missing some of your bombs, that's okay. Your counter spells can sometimes make up for it. Alright, so let's look at this build here. Now, I'm not going to go through each card, so I'm just going to go one by one and allow you to look at the build. Wait a minute, you might be saying. I saw a Voracious Great Shark. I thought that card wasn't that great. Guild Globe was not in the deck. Exclusion Mage? I know. Some of these cards are pretty shocking because I have not listed them at all. But that's part of the beauty of this deck format. You can play a lot of suboptimal cards while still having a strong deck. In fact, when I started this draft, my first pick was actually Runaway Steamkin. That's how weak that first pick was. I picked up Runaway Steamkin, and I was thinking, yes, I'm going to go mono red. My second pick was Chandra. I was good to go. And then my third pack really did not have much. My third pick, there was really nothing to get. In fact, I think I had to grab Silent Departure. So, what makes this nice is if you're playing mono red, you might really be upset by the lack of quality red cards. When you're playing blue red, you have so much more flexibility in how that can work out. A card like let's say Dire Fleet Daredevil can become useful, though I find that I very rarely get its effect off. Its ability to reuse instants and sorceries makes it quite good in a deck built around such cards. Disdainful Stroke is normally not that great, but when you're low on counter spells, it can combo quite well with Quench. And by combo, not actually combo, it can just provide quite a bit of coverage with these two cards here. Chemister's Insight is great if you do not have draw power otherwise. You see, I don't even have an Axe of Agonas, so Chemister's Insight sometimes gives me the extra push I need. And of course, when we're talking about lands, you want to prioritize dual lands. But generally, because there are very few restrictive cards in this deck, especially if you don't have, let's say, Torben, you can settle for 1 or 2 dual lands. You'll be fine. Castle Embereth is pretty nice, though it has much less utility in this deck, obviously, compared to a mono red deck. Castle Vantress, I would say, is useless in this deck. I have drafted it like 3 times, and I have used it a total of 0 games. So, yeah, make with that info as you will. So, I hope you... Oh, right, and so even here, look, you can see Dive Down, not a great card, but it did give me a slight advantage in one game where I was able to pump up a Dragon Master Outcast that I had on the board and allow it to survive and generate a Dragon token. The Dragon Master Outcast, normally not that great, but you might notice I only have, in this case, really 2 bombs. I don't want to count Voracious Great Shark, it's nice, but I really only had 2 bombs. So I put in this Dragon Master Outcast because I figured, why not? I don't really have much better that I can use here. Now, one thing you do want to avoid when playing a deck like this, like it's Castle Vantress, not good. One thing you do want to avoid, though, this is kind of the last message here, is you want to avoid drafting, let's say, a card like Didn't Say Please, or using a card like Didn't Say Please. Can it work? Absolutely. Downside, that 2 blue cost is a bit restrictive. And unlike, let's say, a card like Entrancing Melody, Didn't Say Please doesn't offer you that same upside. So, I would argue it's not as good. Another example could be here, a card, let's say, like Runaway Steamkin. Mono red, it's fantastic, but it's not going to give you as much value in a blue-red deck. So, you stay away from this card, and even if you draft it, even if you pick it up, if you find that you're going from mono red into blue and red, just cut your losses, put it to the side. Alright. And another card you want to avoid here is, let's say, like Tetsuko, right? Could be pretty useful as a legendary card. It might even help you with like Jaya's Immolation, but Generally, your one-drops, like I've mentioned before, they're useful early game, but late game, if you haven't pumped them up, you don't really care about them. They're a chump blocker, or they're just they just help you poke out. Because we prioritize flying one-drops, this card will almost never be necessary. Fibblethip is another card that looks solid, and perhaps if you're really low on 2-drops, you can use this card because it does have draw, but at a 1/1 body, it is not helping you win the game. It does not even fly, it doesn't have menace, it doesn't have any damage dealing ability. It's not that useful. So, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Normally I would play a game here and show you how this deck works in action, but I think this video gives already a load of information, probably more than anyone really asked for. So, good luck on your cube runs. Hopefully you find as much success as I have here, and I wish you the best in all of your games. If you enjoyed this video, like, leave a comment. It's good for the algorithm. And catch me on Twitch. I am Brother Valerian. So that is all, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.